The moment the baby stopped crying on that plane was the moment my life stopped belonging only to me. At the time, I didn't know who the man in the tailor black suit was, and I definitely didn't know that half the cabin was pretending not to stare at him. All I knew was that the sound of that baby crying had been cutting through the air for almost 20 minutes, sharp and desperate, the kind of cry that makes every parent's nerves light up at once. My name is Emily Carter, and I was sitting in seat 22A on a late flight from Chicago to New York, my 4-year-old daughter Lily asleep against my shoulder, her small hand curled into the sleeve of my sweater, like she was afraid I might disappear. The cabin lights were dimmed for the night flight, most passengers trying to sleep, the low hum of the engines filling the space like a steady heartbeat. Except the baby wouldn't stop crying. It wasn't the normal kind of cry either. I've heard thousands of those. I work as a speech therapist for children, and before that I spent years volunteering in pediatric clinics while raising Lily alone. Hunger cries are short and rhythmic. Tired cries fade after a few minutes. This one sounded different. Panicked. Like the little boy's whole world had tilted sideways, and he didn't know how to make it stop. I tried to ignore it at first. Everyone did. The flight attendants had already come by twice, offering warm milk, toys, even those little plastic wings they give kids sometimes. None of it worked. The crying only got louder, echoing through the quiet cabin. A few rows ahead of me, I could see the source now. A man sat in the aisle seat in first class, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle in its life. In his arms was a baby boy, maybe 8 or 9 months old, tiny fists clenched, face red with tears. The man looked out of place. Not uncomfortable exactly, just tense like he was used to controlling rooms, not soothing infants. 2 other men sat nearby, both in dark jackets, watching the aisle instead of the crying child. Something about them made the air feel heavier. I heard a whisper behind me. "That's Adrian Romano." The name passed quietly between 2 passengers like a secret nobody wanted to say too loudly. I didn't know much about organized crime or powerful men in New York, but the way people reacted to that name told me enough. Conversation stopped. Eyes lowered. Even the flight attendants moved a little more carefully around his seat. And still the baby cried. The man tried everything he could think of. He shifted the boy on his shoulder, walked slowly down the aisle, murmured something under his breath. The child cries only grew more frantic. I watched the baby's tiny chest rise and fall too fast, his little body shaking with each breath, and something in my stomach tightened. Because I recognized that sound. Fear. Real fear. My daughter stirred slightly against me, still asleep, and I felt the familiar pull between staying quiet and stepping in. Most people would choose quiet, especially with a man like that sitting 10 rows ahead. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became. That baby wasn't crying because he was hungry. He wasn't tired. He was terrified. And suddenly I realized something else. I might be the only person on that plane who knew how to help him. I tried to stay seated. I really did. Every instinct told me to mind my own business, keep my head down, and let the flight attendants handle it. The man in first class clearly had enough power around him that people avoided even making eye contact. But the baby's cry kept cutting through the cabin, sharper now, more frantic, and the sound twisted something deep in my chest. I shifted slightly in my seat, and Lily stirred against me, her warm breath brushing my neck before she settled again. I gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and looked forward once more. The man had stopped walking the aisle and was now standing beside his seat, the baby pressed against his shoulder. His movements were controlled, careful, but there was tension in every line of his posture. The 2 men seated nearby watched everything with quiet attention, scanning the cabin like they were measuring every person around them. The baby's small hands grabbed at the front of the man's suit jacket, his cries rising again into a shaky wail that made several passengers glance up from their seats. A flight attendant approached cautiously, her voice soft and professional as she offered another suggestion. The man nodded once, polite but distant, and tried adjusting the child again. Nothing changed. The crying only deepened, each breath hitching like the little boy could not calm himself no matter how hard he tried. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes for a moment, listening more carefully now. The rhythm of the cry told me everything. It came in bursts, uneven, followed by quick, shallow breaths. Not hunger, not discomfort. It was the same sound I had heard in therapy rooms from children who had been frightened by something they could not explain. Fear responses do not fade quickly. They build until someone interrupts them. My fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. I could already imagine what would happen if I stayed quiet. Another 10 minutes of crying. Then 20. The baby would exhaust himself eventually, but not before the entire cabin felt the strain of it. I opened my eyes again and looked toward the front of the plane. The man had finally sat down, the baby still crying against his chest, his expression calm but distant, like he was trying to solve a problem with logic instead of instinct. The strange thing was that he did not look angry. He looked lost. That was when the realization settled in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Whoever Adrian Romano was, however powerful he might be on the ground, at 30,000 feet, he was just a father who could not make his child feel safe. And the baby needed someone who understood that feeling. I glanced down at Lily again, remembering the first months after she was born. The nights when she cried until sunrise because the world felt too loud and too new. The only thing that had ever helped was warmth, calm breathing, and a voice that stayed steady. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt. The metal clasp made a soft click that sounded much louder than it should have in the quiet cabin. I waited a moment, half expecting someone to stop me, but no one did. The aisle was dimly lit by the soft overhead lights as I stood and carefully stepped around my sleeping daughter so she would not wake. A few nearby passengers watched with quiet curiosity as I moved forward. By the time I reached the front section of the cabin, the baby's cries had grown hoarse, his tiny face flushed with exhaustion. The two men near the aisle shifted slightly when they saw me approach, their attention sharpening immediately. The man holding the child looked up as well, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were calm eyes, observant, the kind that noticed everything before anyone else did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath and said the first honest thing that came to mind. Your son is not crying because he is hungry. He is crying because he is scared. For a moment, the only sound between us was the baby's cry echoing softly through the dim cabin. Adrian Romano did not react the way most fathers would. He did not argue. He did not dismiss me. He simply studied my face as if measuring whether my words deserved attention. His eyes were darker up close than they looked from my seat, steady and quiet, the kind of gaze that made people stop talking without him needing to raise his voice. The two men beside him shifted slightly in their seats, their attention narrowing on me like they were ready to intervene if necessary. I suddenly became very aware of the fact that I was standing in the middle of first class, speaking to a stranger that half the plane clearly treated like someone important. But the baby cried again, a hoarse, desperate sound, and that reminded me why I had come forward in the first place. I kept my voice calm. Babies cry like this when they feel overwhelmed. The noise of the plane, the pressure change, the unfamiliar faces. It can make them panic if they are already sensitive to it. Adrian looked down at the small boy in his arms. The child's tiny fingers were gripping the fabric of his suit jacket like a lifeline. For a second, something in Adrian's expression shifted, a quiet flicker of concern that softened the hard lines of his face. Then he looked back at me. What do you suggest? His voice was low, controlled, but there was no challenge in it. Only curiosity. I exhaled slowly, relieved that he had not dismissed me outright. Sometimes they need to feel a steady heartbeat and calm breathing. Someone who is not tense. Babies notice tension faster than adults think. One of the men beside him spoke for the first time, his voice firm but polite. The child has been crying since boarding. Nothing has worked. Adrian lifted one hand slightly, and the man fell silent immediately. The gesture was small, but unmistakable. Adrian's attention returned to me. You believe you can calm him. I hesitated for half a second. Confidence is important when working with frightened children. If they sense doubt, it makes everything worse. I believe I can help him feel safe. The cabin seemed to hold its breath around us. Several passengers nearby were watching openly now, their expressions curious, confused, maybe even worried about what would happen next. A flight attendant paused a few steps away, clearly unsure whether she should step in or allow the conversation to continue. Adrian looked down again at the crying child, then back at me. His expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told me he was weighing something carefully. Finally, he spoke again. His name is Lucas. The way he said the name was softer than anything else he had said so far. Lucas's cries came in another uneven burst, his tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. I took a small step closer, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening the way I had learned during years of therapy sessions with frightened children. "Hello, Lucas," I said gently, even though I knew he was far too young to understand the words. Adrian watched every movement I made. I could feel the attention of the entire cabin resting on the moment. Then Adrian did something unexpected. He shifted Lucas slightly in his arms and looked directly at me. "If you are wrong," he said quietly, "he will only cry harder." I nodded once. "That is true." Another brief silence passed between us. Then Adrian leaned forward just enough that Lucas was closer to me. "Show me what you mean, Ms. Carter," I replied. "Emily Carter." Adrian Romano studied me one more second, then he slowly placed his son into my arms. I had held hundreds of children over the years, but the moment Adrian Romano placed Lucas into my arms, the cabin suddenly felt very quiet. The baby was lighter than I expected, his small body trembling with the leftover rhythm of crying, tiny fists still clenched in the fabric of Adrian's sleeve until they slowly released. His face was warm and damp with tears, cheeks flushed from the effort of breathing too fast for too long. For a brief second, the crying grew louder, the kind of startled wail babies make when they are moved from one set of arms to another. I adjusted him carefully against my shoulder, supporting the back of his head the way instinct had taught me years ago when Lily was the same size. "Easy there, Lucas," I whispered softly. The words were less important than the tone. "Calm, slow, steady." Babies respond to rhythm long before they understand language. I rested one hand gently along his back and began to rock very slightly, matching the slow rise and fall of my breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. At first, nothing changed. Lucas continued crying, his small body still tight with fear, his breath catching between every cry. Around us, the entire front section of the cabin had gone silent. Even the quiet hum of the engines seemed softer somehow, as if the moment had narrowed down to the tiny space between a frightened baby and the person trying to calm him. I could feel Adrian watching closely. Not impatient, not angry, just intensely focused, like a man observing something unfamiliar that might matter more than he expected. I kept rocking slowly, letting my breathing stay steady so Lucas could feel it through my chest. Then I began humming very quietly, the same gentle tune I had used countless nights with Lily when she was too restless to sleep. The melody was simple, soft enough that only Lucas and maybe Adrian could hear it. At first, the baby's cries continued exactly the same, but after several seconds, the pattern shifted. One cry came slightly weaker than the one before it, then another. Lucas's fingers loosened a little against my sweater. His breathing was still uneven, but the sharp edge of panic began to soften. That was the first sign. Babies calm in stages. First, the breathing slows, then the body relaxes. The crying fades last. I kept humming, never rushing the rhythm. Slowly, Lucas's small body leaned more heavily against my shoulder. His cries dropped from frantic wails into soft whimpers. A few more seconds passed. Then the cabin fell completely silent. Lucas had stopped crying. Not gradually, completely. The sudden quiet felt almost surreal after 20 minutes of constant noise. I heard someone a few rows back release a quiet breath of relief. Lucas's breathing settled into a slow rhythm, his tiny hand resting against my collarbone like he had decided it was safe to let go of the panic. I gently rubbed small circles across his back, continuing the soft humming so the calm would hold. When I finally looked up, Adrian Romano was still watching me with the same focused intensity, but his expression had changed in a way that was impossible to miss. The tension that had been locked into his shoulders earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter, something thoughtful. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Adrian leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. That took less than a minute. I gave a small smile, careful not to disturb Lucas, who was now blinking slowly with heavy eyelids. Sometimes children just need someone who is not afraid of their fear. Adrian studied his son's peaceful face for a long moment before speaking again. That is the first time he has stopped crying during a flight. I shifted Lucas slightly so Adrian could see him more clearly. He's exhausted now. Adrian nodded slowly, but his eyes returned to me almost immediately. Who taught you to do that? I brushed a strand of hair away from Lucas's forehead and answered honestly. My daughter did. Lucas stayed quiet against my shoulder, his small body finally relaxed in a way that only happens when a baby decides the world is safe again. His breathing had settled into slow, steady rhythms, the kind that made his tiny chest rise and fall gently against my sweater. I continued rocking him without thinking, the motion automatic now, the same small rhythm I had used with Lily for years. Around us, the cabin gradually returned to life. A few passengers shifted in their seats again. Someone cleared their throats softly. The flight attendants exchanged quick, relieved glances near the galley. The tension that filled the plane earlier seemed to dissolve into the low, steady hum of the engines. Adrian Romano, however, had not moved. He remained seated in the aisle seat, his attention still entirely on Lucas. The intensity in his gaze had softened, replaced by something quieter, something closer to relief than I expected from a man whose presence alone had made half the cabin uneasy earlier. For a long moment, he simply watched his son sleeping against my shoulder as if memorizing the sight. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice again so it did not disturb the child. Your daughter taught you that. I nodded carefully. Yes. Lily had terrible colic when she was a baby. Some nights the only thing that worked was breathing slowly and letting her feel my heartbeat. Lucas shifted slightly at the sound of our voices, but did not wake. His tiny fingers curled loosely against the fabric of my sleeve. Adrian noticed the movement immediately, his eyes following every small detail the way only a parent would. How old is she? Your daughter. 4 years old. She is back there asleep in row 22. Adrian glanced briefly down the aisle toward the dimly lit rows of economy seats, then returned his attention to Lucas. For a moment, he seemed to be thinking about something far away. Finally, he spoke again, more quietly than before. Lucas has not slept well since his mother passed away last year. The words were calm, but there was a weight behind them that needed no explanation. I felt a small ache in my chest. That makes sense, I said softly. Babies notice absence even when they cannot explain it. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Lucas breathe for several seconds before speaking again. The specialists say he will grow out of it. But every flight is the same. Every unfamiliar place. Every crowd. He does not calm easily anymore. I adjusted Lucas slightly, careful not to wake him. He just needs consistency and calm signals from the adults around him. Babies read the room faster than we do. Adrian looked at me again with that same thoughtful intensity from earlier. And you're not afraid of him. I shook my head gently. Of Lucas? No. Adrian almost smiled at that, though the expression was so brief it disappeared almost instantly. I meant me. The quiet honesty of the question caught me off guard. I considered the answer for a second before responding. I think you are a father who wants his son to feel safe. Adrian held my gaze for a long moment, studying my face the way he had earlier when I first approached him in the aisle. Whatever conclusion he reached seemed to settle something in his mind. He leaned back slightly in his seat and exhaled slowly, the tension finally leaving his posture completely. Lucas stirred again, letting out a small, sleepy sound before relaxing once more against my shoulder. Adrian watched that tiny movement like it was the most important thing in the world. Then his voice dropped to a quiet certainty. Emily Carter, it appears my son has decided he trusts you. Lucas slept for several more minutes against my shoulder, his breathing steady and warm through the thin fabric of my sweater. I continued rocking him slowly, the small movement so natural now that I barely noticed I was doing it. The cabin lights remained dim, and most passengers had returned to their quiet routines, but every now and then I still caught someone glancing toward the front of the plane, curious about the sudden silence that had replaced the earlier chaos. Adrian Romano had not taken his eyes off his son. The earlier tension that had surrounded him like an invisible shield had softened into something quieter, something thoughtful. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, but purposeful. "How long have you worked with children?" I answered quietly, so I would not wake Lucas. "Almost 6 years professionally. Speech therapy mostly. A lot of my work involves children who struggle with anxiety or developmental delays." Adrian nodded slowly, as if placing that information somewhere important in his mind. "And you travel often with your daughter?" "Not often. This trip was necessary. Lily and I are moving to New York." The words felt strange even as I said them out loud. It had only been 3 days since I had accepted the position at a small pediatric clinic in Brooklyn. The move was supposed to be a fresh start. Adrian seemed to notice the hesitation in my voice. "A new job?" "Yes. A small clinic that works with children who need speech and behavioral therapy. It is nothing fancy, but it is meaningful work." Adrian studied my face carefully, the way someone studies a puzzle they are beginning to understand. Then he glanced down at Lucas again. The baby had not moved at all, his tiny head resting comfortably near my shoulder, one small hand still curled loosely against my sleeve. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat and spoke again after a moment. "You said babies read the room faster than adults." "They do, especially when they have experienced stress early." He watched Lucas breathe for several seconds before continuing. "The specialist we consulted focused mostly on medical explanations. Hearing problems, sleep cycles, nutrition. They never mentioned fear." I smiled gently. "Fear is not always easy to measure in a chart, but children feel it strongly." Adrian absorbed that quietly. The soft engine noise filled the brief silence between us. Then he said something that caught me slightly off guard. "If my son were one of your patients, what would you recommend?" I considered the question carefully. Consistency first. Familiar voices. Gentle routines. And most importantly, someone who can remain calm, even when he becomes overwhelmed. Adrian's gaze shifted from Lucas back to me. "Someone like you." I let out a small breath of quiet amusement. "There are many therapists who can do this work. I'm sure your family can find someone excellent in New York." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Lucas for another long moment before speaking again in a tone that sounded almost like he had already reached a decision. "Perhaps." Lucas shifted slightly then, letting out a small, sleepy sound as he moved his head closer against my shoulder. I instinctively adjusted my hold to support him. Adrian observed the movement carefully, the faintest trace of appreciation appearing in his expression. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty. "Emily Carter, you said you were moving to Brooklyn." "Yes." Adrian gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Then his eyes met mine with calm, direct focus. "That may be a fortunate coincidence." Adrian Romano's words lingered in the quiet space between us longer than I expected. "That may be a fortunate coincidence." I continued rocking Lucas gently, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against my shoulder while I considered what he meant. Outside the small oval window beside us, the night sky stretched endlessly dark, the faint glow of distant city lights far below like scattered stars. Inside the cabin, the engines hummed with calm consistency, the kind of background noise that makes everything feel strangely suspended in time. I finally looked back at Adrian. "Coincidences can be helpful sometimes," I said quietly, though I was not entirely sure where the conversation was heading. Adrian gave a small nod, but did not elaborate immediately. Instead, he watched Lucas again, studying the peaceful expression on his son's face as if he were seeing it for the first time in weeks. For a man who carried himself with so much quiet authority, there was something almost cautious about the way he spoke next. The specialists we have consulted in New York focus mostly on medical treatment plans, clinical routines, evaluations, progress charts. None of them have produced results that look like this. His gaze returned to me briefly. Lucas has not fallen asleep this calmly in months. I adjusted Lucas slightly, so he remained comfortable, supporting his small head carefully. Sometimes children do not respond to structure alone. They respond to connection first. Adrian seemed to consider that idea carefully. Connection. Yes. He leaned back slightly in his seat, folding his hands together as he thought. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. When we land in New York, I will continue searching for someone who understands how to help Lucas feel secure again. Someone with patience and experience. His eyes lifted to meet mine with quiet directness. Someone who understands fear the way you described it earlier. I had the sudden feeling I knew exactly where the conversation was going. I shifted my weight slightly but kept my voice calm. There are many skilled therapists in New York. Adrian gave a small, thoughtful smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I have met many of them already. Another brief silence followed, filled only by the low sound of the aircraft moving through the night sky. Lucas stirred again, but did not wake, his fingers curling slightly, as if he had found a comfortable dream. Adrian watched that small movement closely before speaking again. You said you will be working at a clinic in Brooklyn. Yes. It is a small practice that focuses on children with speech and emotional development challenges. Adrian nodded once more. Brooklyn is not far from where Lucas and I live. Something about the way he said it made the sentence feel less like information and more like a carefully placed step in a larger conversation. I glanced down at Lucas again before answering. Your son does not need a therapist every minute of the day. He needs routine and people who make him feel safe. Adrian's gaze remained steady. That may be true, but I suspect he has already chosen someone who helps him feel that way. I met his eyes again. Adrian Romano was not smiling, but there was a quiet certainty in his expression that made the air between us feel slightly different than before. Lucas shifted again, pressing closer against my shoulder as if agreeing with him. Adrian noticed that small movement instantly. Then he spoke in a calm voice that carried an unmistakable sense of decision. Emily Carter, I would like to discuss an opportunity with you when we land in New York. Adrian Romano's words settled into my mind with quiet weight. I would like to discuss an opportunity with you when we land in New York. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked down at Lucas, who was still sleeping peacefully against my shoulder, his tiny breaths warm and steady. It was remarkable how different he looked now compared to the frantic baby I'd seen earlier. The tension had completely disappeared from his small face. His fingers rested loosely against my sleeve, as if he had decided this was the safest place in the world for the moment. I continued rocking him gently while I thought about Adrian's offer. The engines hummed steadily around us, and the cabin lights remained dim, giving everything a calm, late-night quiet that made the moment feel strangely private, even though dozens of passengers sat only a few feet away. Finally, I looked back at Adrian. What kind of opportunity? Adrian did not answer right away. He studied Lucas for another few seconds, almost as if he wanted to confirm that his son truly was sleeping peacefully before continuing the conversation. Then he spoke in the same calm tone he had used all evening. I would like someone experienced to spend time with Lucas regularly. Someone who understands how to help him feel secure again. A professional environment is useful, but what he responded to tonight was not a clinical routine. It was instinct. His eyes lifted to meet mine again. You have that instinct. I shifted slightly in my seat, careful not to disturb Lucas. I appreciate the compliment, but I already accepted a position at the clinic I mentioned earlier. Adrian nodded once, as if he had expected that response. Yes, you did say that. The quiet certainty in his voice made me feel like he was already thinking several steps ahead. Then he continued. A part-time arrangement would not interfere with your work at the clinic. A few hours each week would be sufficient. Lucas stirred slightly, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh before settling again. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. His expression softened again, the same way it had earlier when Lucas first stopped crying. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sincerity that surprised me. Emily Carter, I have resources that allow me to create comfortable circumstances for the people who help my family. But what matters more to me is trust. My son trusted you within minutes tonight. That is not something I can easily ignore. I held his gaze for a moment, considering his words carefully. The truth was that the offer made sense professionally. Helping children feel safe again was exactly the kind of work I had devoted my career to. But this situation was different. Adrian Romano was not an ordinary father looking for a therapist. His name alone carried an unspoken gravity that everyone on the plane seemed to understand. I glanced once more at Lucas, whose peaceful breathing continued without interruption. He clearly felt safe, and that meant something. I finally spoke again. I want you to think about it. Adrian nodded slowly, completely unsurprised by the answer. That is reasonable. We still have time before landing. Outside the window, the faint glow of New York City had begun to appear in the distance, a soft golden horizon stretching across the dark sky. Adrian followed my gaze briefly before looking back at Lucas. When he spoke again, his voice carried quiet confidence. I suspect this will not be the last time our paths cross, Emily Carter. The first lights of New York City grew brighter beneath the airplane as the pilot's voice came over the cabin speakers announcing our descent. The calm hum of the engines shifted slightly as the aircraft began lowering toward the glowing grid of streets far below. Most passengers stirred awake around us, adjusting blankets, opening window shades, gathering bags. But Lucas remained asleep against my shoulder, completely unaware that the plane had begun its final approach. His breathing stayed slow and steady, each small inhale rising gently against my chest. I continued rocking him softly, more out of habit than necessity now. Across from me, Adrian Romano watched the city lights appear through the window, though every few seconds his gaze returned to Lucas. For a man whose presence seemed to command entire rooms, there was something quietly human in the way he watched his son sleep. The earlier tension that had followed him when the baby was crying had disappeared completely. In its place was something closer to gratitude, though he had not said the word. After a moment, Adrian looked back at me. The city looks different from up here at night. I followed his gaze through the window, where the lights of Manhattan stretched like a glowing river of gold and white. It does. Adrian nodded once. Then he spoke again in the same calm voice he had used all evening. Emily Carter, I meant what I said earlier. The opportunity one mentioned was not a casual suggestion. I listened carefully, but kept my voice quiet so Lucas would not wake. I understand. Adrian rested his forearms lightly against the armrests of his seat, the posture relaxed but still carrying that quiet authority that seemed natural to him. My son has not trusted anyone new since his mother passed away. Tonight, he trusted you within minutes. That is not something I take lightly. I looked down at Lucas again. His small fingers had tightened slightly around my sweater, as if the motion of the descending plane had reached him in his sleep. I gently rested my hand across his back until the movement faded and his breathing returned to its calm rhythm. Adrian watched the small exchange closely. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone used to making decisions that shaped the future. When we land, my driver will be waiting outside the terminal. If you are comfortable, he can take you and your daughter safely to wherever you are staying in Brooklyn tonight. I blinked in surprise. That is generous, but not necessary. Adrian shook his head once, already anticipating the response. It is not generosity. It is practicality. New York can be overwhelming at 2 o'clock in the morning, especially for someone arriving with a child. I hesitated, realizing he was probably right. Lily would still be half asleep when we landed, and navigating taxis in a new city at that hour would not be easy. Adrian seemed to read the calculation on my face. There is no obligation attached to the ride, only convenience. I allowed a small smile. In that case, thank you. Adrian inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Outside the window, the airplane dipped lower, the streets of Brooklyn now clearly visible beneath us. The pilot announced that we would be landing in just a few minutes. Lucas stirred again as the landing gear extended with a distant mechanical hum. His eyelids fluttered slowly before opening halfway. For a brief second, he looked confused, his small face searching the unfamiliar cabin. Then his eyes focused on me. He did not cry. Instead, his tiny fingers tightened gently around my sleeve, as if confirming that I was still there. Adrian noticed the moment instantly. His voice was soft but certain when he spoke. "It seems Lucas has already decided you are part of his world now.